They called it peace. But on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors, the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to sign away vast territories, accept sole blame for the war, and shoulder reparations of 132 billion gold marks. The paperwork was celebrated as the end of conflict, but every clause lit a fuse. In just 4 years, hyperinflation would make a single US dollar worth 4.2 trillion marks, and millions would lose their life savings overnight. The world saw the peace that made war. But what really turned a ceasefire into a countdown for the next catastrophe? The answer reveals how a flawed peace set the world on a path no one wanted, yet few dared to prevent. Article 231 appeared on page 1, just beneath the signatures. Its language was spare. Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. No mention of guilt, no courtroom. Yet, to Germans, the meaning was unmistakable. The Allies had written a clause that turned defeat into confession, and confession into a bill. The reparations figure, 132 billion gold marks, was more than twice Germany's annual economic output. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, called it an injustice of the deepest order. He calculated that paying even half would cripple the German economy for a generation. The Allies disagreed. Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, insisted Germany could afford it. He pressed for the highest sum, arguing that French towns and mines lay in ruins while German soil remained untouched. For Clemenceau, the bill was security, a way to keep Germany weak and France safe. For the German delegation, it was a sentence. They argued that the war had not been theirs alone, that blame belonged to many. Their protests fell flat. The reparations were not a single payment, but a complex structure of bonds, A and B bonds totaling 50 billion marks, and a third, C bonds, left blank, a threat more than a promise. The C bonds existed to satisfy public opinion in Paris and London, but Germany was told it would only pay on the first two. Even so, the initial sum staggered Berlin. The government called it a dictated peace. Newspapers ran black borders in protest. On June 28, 1919, as German delegates signed in the Hall of Mirrors, crowds at home mourned not an end to war, but the start of humiliation. In the months that followed, the war guilt clause became a rallying cry for every party, from socialists to monarchists. Politicians declared the debt unpayable. Pamphlets and posters called for resistance. The new Weimar government, desperate for stability, tried to cooperate, hoping that compliance would earn sympathy and revision, but the numbers did not add up. Germany's gold reserves had been drained by war. Its industrial heartlands, Saar, Upper Silesia, were being carved away. Reparations demanded gold, coal, timber, ships, livestock. Each payment felt like another piece of the country lost. The world's bankers doubted Germany could pay. American and British officials warned that squeezing too hard would backfire, collapsing the fragile German state. Keynes's warnings echoed in editorial pages across Europe and America. But for the Allies, especially France, the memory of destruction was too fresh. Clemenceau would not yield. Germany must pay, he said. They must pay heavily, and they will pay. Article 231 and the reparations bill did more than empty German coffers. They emptied trust. The treaty's legal sting cut deeper than any battlefield wound. To millions, it was not peace. It was a verdict, and the countdown had begun. Germany's map shrank overnight. 13% of its land vanished, redrawn by foreign hands. The coal-rich Saar Basin was handed to the League of Nations, its mines leased to France. Upper Silesia, after a bitter plebiscite and street battles, was split. Poland took the factories and most of the coal. Germany kept only the western fields. Alsace-Lorraine, lost to France in 1871, returned to Paris. The Polish corridor carved a path from the Baltic to Warsaw, isolating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig became a free city, its fate decided by diplomats, not residents. In the east, Posen and West Prussia joined Poland, cutting deep into German farmland. Northern Schleswig voted to rejoin Denmark. Eupen and Malmedy went to Belgium. Overseas, every colony was stripped away. Togo, Cameroon, Namibia, New Guinea transferred to Allied powers as mandates, erasing Germany's global reach. The numbers told the story. 1/10 of the population, 6 to 7 million people, now lived under foreign flags. Nearly a quarter of Germany's coal output, half its iron ore, and a fifth of its potash were lost with the land. Factories, railways, and entire towns shifted borders. For French leaders, these losses were the price of security. For German families, it felt like amputation. Territorial losses were only the beginning. The treaty's military clauses targeted the heart of German power. The army, once millions strong, was capped at 100,000 men, barely enough to police the borders, let alone defend them. No conscription, no reserves. Officers limited to 4,000, with long service terms to prevent a hidden cadre of future commanders. The general staff, architects of victory and defeat, was abolished. Military schools cut to 3. Paramilitary groups, Freikorps, veterans leagues, were outlawed. The Navy was reduced to 6 old battleships, 6 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats. No submarines, no Air Force, military or naval. Aircraft, tanks, armored cars, heavy artillery, poison gas, all banned. Even the manufacture of arms was tightly controlled, limited to a handful of Allied-approved factories. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial shield, was stripped of defenses. No troops, no fortifications, no maneuvers within 50 kilometers east of the Rhine. Fortresses along the river were dismantled. The region was left open, a buffer for France, a vulnerability for Germany. Any violation, the treaty warned, would be treated as an act of war. For French officials, these terms promised safety. For German officers, they spelled humiliation. The new army was a shadow. No tanks, no planes, no heavy guns, no chance to train the next generation. Veterans watched as their units disbanded, their colors cased, their traditions erased. Politicians in Berlin called it the dictated peace. Newspapers spoke of chains and shackles. But the limits did more than disarm a nation. They planted a grievance. Every restriction became a rallying cry for those who dreamed of restoration. The cap of 100,000 men turned into a symbol. Proof, some said, that Germany was not trusted, not respected, not finished. The promise of security for France became the seed of resentment for Germany. In the years ahead, that resentment would find its champions. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Their goal was simple: collect the coal and timber that Germany had failed to deliver as reparations. Locomotives, rail yards, and steel mills fell under foreign control overnight. The German government called for passive resistance. Workers downed tools, factory whistles fell silent, and trains stopped running. But the state promised to pay their wages as long as they held out. Money, pride, and hope. To fund this standoff, Berlin's printing presses ran day and night. Banknotes poured into the streets, first by the millions, then by the billions. By July, $1 cost 160,000 marks. By October, 242 million. In November, the mark crashed through every floor, 4.2 trillion to the dollar. Pay packets were handed out twice a day. Housewives raced to market before prices doubled by noon. Workers carried cash in wheelbarrows, but by the time they reached the bakery, a loaf of bread cost more than yesterday's rent. Savings evaporated. Pensioners who had stored away for decades found their life's work reduced to shreds of colored paper. The middle class, once the backbone of German society, watched as their security vanished in a matter of weeks. Children scavenged for coal. Shopkeepers bartered shoes for potatoes. In Berlin, one artist remembered, people used banknotes as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying paste. The government's calculations were brutal. Keeping resistance alive meant printing more money. But every new note made the mark less valuable. Foreign currency became the only lifeline. Those with dollars or francs could eat. Those without starved. The crisis fed on itself. As faith in the mark collapsed, so did faith in the Republic. Politicians blamed the French. The French blamed German sabotage. Extremists blamed everyone in power. By autumn, the streets of the Ruhr were lined with shuttered factories and silent railways. Unemployment soared. Food riots broke out in Hamburg and Dresden. In the countryside, farmers refused to sell grain for worthless cash. The sense of chaos was inescapable. The world's most advanced economy had become a cautionary tale. When the government finally called off passive resistance in September, the damage was done. The mark was dead. The trauma of 1923 left scars that would not heal. For millions, the promise of democracy had turned into a nightmare of empty shelves and broken trust. In the ruins, blame found new targets, and the search for stability would drive German politics into darker territory. Rumors spread through Berlin's beer halls and union halls alike. Germany hadn't lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by politicians and profiteers at home. The stab-in-the-back story, first whispered by generals like Ludendorff, began to circulate in pamphlets and speeches. It wasn't just the far right. Social Democrats, centrists, and even some communists clung to the idea that the Republic's leaders had signed away Germany's honor for their own gain. Posters appeared blaming the November criminals for everything from lost territory to empty shelves. In November 1923, as the mark collapsed and breadlines snaked through city streets, Adolf Hitler marched into Munich's Bürgerbraukeller, Bürgerbraukeller. He fired a pistol in the air and declared a national revolution. The beer hall putsch ended in chaos, with police firing into the crowd and 16 Nazis lying dead in the street. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. He served just 9 months, dictating Mein Kampf to his loyal secretary. The book blamed Germany's misfortunes on the Treaty of Versailles, the war guilt clause, and a long list of internal enemies, Marxists, Jews, and the architects of Weimar democracy. While extremists plotted, the government scrambled for a fix. American bankers and diplomats stepped in with the Dawes Plan in 1924. U.S. loans poured into Germany, more than 25 billion marks between 1924 and 1929, propping up the currency and helping factories roar back to life. Reparations were rescheduled and softened, and for a few years the economy seemed to stabilize. Berlin's nightclubs filled, new cinemas opened, and the mark settled. But the prosperity was built on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. The myth of betrayal didn't fade. It hardened. Every payment to the Allies, every foreign loan, every compromise by the Weimar coalition was ammunition for radicals on both ends of the spectrum. The center parties, Social Democrats, Catholic centrists, moderate liberals, lost ground in every election. Nationalists called for revenge. Communists called for revolution. Paramilitary groups clashed in the streets. The Republic's defenders found themselves squeezed between rising extremes and falling trust. Then, in 1929, Wall Street crashed. American credit vanished overnight. German factories shuttered, banks failed, and joblessness soared. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. Soup kitchens overflowed. The middle class, already battered by hyperinflation, watched their savings disappear again. The fragile confidence that had held the Republic together unraveled. Promises of moderation and gradual recovery rang hollow against the drumbeat of radical slogans and scapegoats. In the space where hope had collapsed, men like Hitler found their opening. The League of Nations was built on paper promises and procedural rules. Every major decision required unanimity, not just among the Council, but among all its permanent members. That meant Britain, France, Italy, and Japan each held a veto. When disagreements arose, as they often did, paralysis set in. The United States, whose president had championed the League, never joined at all. Without American weight, the League's authority rested on shifting sands. Britain and France, the two remaining pillars, rarely pulled in the same direction. French leaders, haunted by memories of invasion, wanted strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles. They pressed for military guarantees and swift action against any German defiance. British officials, wary of new wars and skeptical of the treaty's harshness, favored negotiation and leniency. Each crisis revealed this split. When France pushed for sanctions, Britain hesitated. When Britain called for compromise, France bristled at the risk. The League's covenant promised collective security, but its machinery was slow and easily jammed. Any one member could block action, and the rules made it impossible to move quickly against treaty violations. There was no standing army, no automatic sanctions, only debate and delay. When disputes broke out, in the Saar, in the Rhineland, or over reparations, the League drafted resolutions and sent commissions, but rarely acted with force. Germany, watching from the margins, saw the cracks. If the League could not enforce its own rules, then the guardrails meant to contain German ambition were little more than guidelines. Each test, whether over disarmament, borders, or reparations, revealed how little appetite remained for confrontation. The absence of a credible deterrent turned every prohibition into a challenge, not a barrier. In the vacuum left by divided allies and a toothless League, the cost of defiance fell, and the risks of early breach faded. Germany stepped out of the League of Nations in October 1933. The official explanation was simple. The Western powers refused to grant military equality. But behind the scenes, rearmament had already begun. Hitler's government poured money into secret weapons programs, building up stockpiles and training officers in disguised paramilitary groups. The world's attention drifted elsewhere. No sanctions followed, no real pressure to halt the buildup. By March 1935, the gloves were off. Hitler announced the return of conscription, openly defying the 100,000-man limit set by Versailles. The new Wehrmacht would field 36 divisions, over 500,000 men. Within days, the Luftwaffe emerged from the shadows, a modern air force that Versailles had banned outright. British and French leaders protested, but their words carried little threat. Instead, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June, allowing Germany to build a fleet up to 35% the size of the Royal Navy. The treaty's naval restrictions, once absolute, became a matter of negotiation. On March 7, 1936, German troops crossed into the Rhineland. Under Versailles and the Locarno treaties, this region was to remain demilitarized, a buffer for France, a warning zone for Europe. Hitler gambled everything on Allied hesitation. His generals carried sealed orders to retreat if French forces advanced. But no one moved. French ministers debated. British officials called it a return to German soil. The soldiers stayed. Within months, German engineers began building new fortifications along the western frontier. The pattern was set. In March 1938, German forces rolled across the border into Austria. Article 80 of Versailles had guaranteed Austrian independence. Now, Nazi banners hung from Vienna's government buildings. Crowds cheered as Hitler declared the Anschluss complete. No Allied army intervened. The League of Nations issued statements and appeals. The borders changed anyway. By September, the Sudetenland crisis brought Europe to the edge. Hitler demanded the borderlands of Czechoslovakia, home to millions of ethnic Germans. British and French leaders, desperate to avoid another war, agreed to the Munich settlement. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited to the table. In less than 5 years, every major military and territorial barrier set by Versailles had fallen, one breach inviting the next. Each act of defiance brought rewards, not consequences. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed a 132 billion goldmark reparations bill and strict military limits on Germany. Documents from the period show how Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, galvanized German resentment, while records from 1923 detail the Ruhr occupation and the hyperinflation that followed. These punitive terms and economic crises eroded trust in democracy and fueled the rise of extremist parties. Allied archives confirm that divisions and weak enforcement left the treaty's promises hollow, as seen in the minutes of League of Nations meetings and U.S. congressional records rejecting League membership. Yet, not all questions are settled. Some diplomatic communications remain sealed, and debate continues over how alternative settlements might have worked. What is clear is that Versailles did not make future conflict inevitable, but its failures, documented step by step, made war more likely. Today, historians agree that peace built on blame and imbalance is unstable. The records show Versailles was not the sole cause of World War II, but it was a powerful catalyst that turned a ceasefire into a long fuse.